My name is Brad Brown, and I'm an instructor with WebAge Solutions. I'm also an independent practitioner. WebAge employs, for instructors, a mix of both full-time instructors and independents, part-time people like me. So we're able to put forward for any given class and any given subject, really the best people that are available to deliver the content. And so for many of us, like what I'm talking about today, the subject matter isn't just some abstract class that we're delivering, it's something that we're actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And the subjects that I'm talking about today are things that I do every day with clients. So they're things that are really very near and dear to my heart, and that's true of all the instructors for all of our material. What we're going to talk about today is the idea that Agile and architecture are things that are complementary. They're practices that in many organizations are kind of, they're at odds with each other in many organizations. And that's a little bit due to myths and misunderstanding history. We'll explore that a little bit. But we're going to make the argument that the whole, Agile and architecture together, is greater than the sum of its parts. That being able to do Agile architecture actually gives more benefit to an organization than doing Agile and architecture as two separate silos. And to be able to do that, look at what does it mean to be an Agile architect? What is the Agile architecture process? Now, this is potentially a big topic, and so hopefully nobody's expecting magic answers today. There's no magic fairy dust that you can sprinkle on your projects to make everything suddenly work. But a bit of understanding of the issues and concerns and a glimpse of kind of where the path can take you can be a really good driver towards really looking for how to make Agile and architecture work together in an organization. And my thesis, my kind of argument, is that Agile's the bomb. Agile's great. In many organizations, this is the development practice that the organization is moving towards or has already moved towards. It's certainly not universal. There are success stories, failure stories, like anything. But Agile really is the way that a lot of systems are built in organizations today. But Agile can run into issues. And I'm going to claim that Agile benefits significantly from, even needs, architecture to avoid potentially stumbling. What architecture can provide is a path for development, the path for effective development that still retains the benefits of Agile, those desirable qualities that we want from Agile development. And contrary to what people might feel, rather than actually restricting agility, employment of architecture practices can make a team more agile. And that seems a little counterintuitive to a lot of people, but it can make a team more agile by helping to avoid blind alleys, helping to avoid need for rework and running into issues. And significantly, and I'm going to try and make this point more strongly later, architecture can really help Agile development practices in the long run by giving a bigger picture of where a solution needs to be able to go to meet longer term needs and quality of service requirements that are often harder to think about in the thrust and parry of an individual sprint. Now, part of the challenge that we have is that in many organizations, Agile and architecture are seen as practices that are really at odds with each other. They're almost a little bit contradictory. And so this notion that Agile and architecture are somehow in competition, well, we can look at where this comes from with a little bit of historical perspective and kind of what's essential about Agile and architecture that might lead us to these conclusions. Well, so let's start with Agile. What's essential about Agile? Well, there are various flavors of Agile, but for the most part, we can look at the essence of Agile by looking at the Agile Manifesto. And most of you will have seen this. I'm not going to try and go into this in detail because it's familiar to a lot of people. But the kind of essential idea of Agile, or an essential idea of Agile, is that there are certain practices that we really value. And they're practices that may be a little bit different than we would have valued in pre-Agile, kind of traditional classical days. We value things like individuals and interactions and working software, collaboration and responsiveness to change. And we think of those as being things that we value over other things. The manifesto is actually structured that way. We value working software or comprehensive documentation. We value responsiveness to change over following a plan. Now, that's great. And I have no argument with this. I think this is all true, but there's a piece of this that is easy to miss in reading the Agile Manifesto and looking at Agile practices. And the piece that's easy to miss are those words down on the bottom. Well, there's value in the items on the right. We value the items on the left more. People often have a tendency to take that a little bit too far, to think that the value things on the right, processes and tools, documentation, a plan, are things that have no value or very little value. And that's not necessarily true. And in fact, I'm going to argue that the bigger a system is, and the more complex the problem we're trying to solve is, the more those things on the right actually are valuable. Not in the sense that we should value them more than the things on the left. No, not the point. But there are things on the right, a plan, documentation, process, and tools, that it turns out are kind of necessary to keep things under control. And the Agile Manifesto doesn't contradict that. In fact, it embraces that idea. There is value in tools, documentation, plans, contract negotiation. There is value in those things. They're necessary things. They're just not the only things. In fact, the things on the left, this interaction, the flexibility, having working software, well, that's how we actually deliver value to our business customers. Things on the right are control mechanisms, the things that help us do that effectively. So let's keep that in mind for a moment, because it's going to play into how Agile and architecture actually complement each other. If these are the essences, the essentials of Agile, what are the essentials of architecture? Well, it's a little bit harder to pin down because architecture is a pretty general topic. It means a number of different things. There are various kinds of architecture that have different sets of concerns. In the context of this discussion, we're primarily interested in solution architecture, or if you want to call it application architecture, whatever term you want to use. Specifically, the architecture of the solution that we're trying to work on, that we're trying to build. Effectively, what we're interested in is the architecture at the same scope, if you will, as our concerns about Agile. Agile development practices will be in the service of creating a particular working solution for business. Well, that's the same scope of responsibility that we're concerned about with architecture in the context of this discussion. So then architecture is concerned with the structure and organization of a system. Its parts and how the parts fit together and how they work, what they do. And it's not just concerned with arbitrarily what are the parts and how they fit together. It's how they actually work together to provide particular behavior. Both behavior that delivers functions, kind of functional requirements. But a lot of what architecture is about how the system provides behavior in qualitative, the quality of service terms, concerns. Things like availability and scalability. To have a highly scalable system actually has a radically different structure and organization than a system that's really not very scalable at all. To make kind of internet scale applications, there's some significant architectural implications to that. Well, that's a lot of what architecture is about, how the system provides its behavior. And the way that architecture deals with that is by representing the solution, the system, as an abstraction. So it's not a detailed description of the actual system. It's an abstraction of the essential nature, structure, and organization of a system. And what that abstraction gives us, what that architecture gives us, is a blueprint or a framework that can help guide the building of the solution. And we'll see in a minute, that's where a lot of the tie-in between architecture and agile software development come together. But historically, again, there's been a lot of conflict between these things. We think of architecture and agile development as being kind of in conflict. Why is that? Well, some of that's just history. It's where these practices came from and how they've evolved, particularly in larger organizations. And a lot of it is also myths and misunderstandings. It's things that we don't necessarily internalize about with the true nature of what we're trying to do with Agile and architecture, that there really isn't as much conflict as one might think. But we can see where some of that conflict might come from if we think about the history of these. Architecture, particularly in large organizations, has often been seen as a separate phase in a long software development lifecycle. We have an architecture phase where we develop the architecture for a solution, and then that goes into design and development. And if we think of this in a kind of exaggerated waterfall, architecture happens first, and other things happen. Architecture is done. It's kind of isolated from development. And it's something that in a lot of organizations, again, particularly larger organizations, is done by specialists, architects, people who have a special title. I'm an architect. I'm this kind of an architect or that kind of an architect. And we may use specialized tools, notation. We may have architecture tools like Sparks, EA, whatever we happen to have. That all of these things kind of set architecture apart from the rest of the overall development process. Agile has a little bit of a different history. Agile tends to, and I don't want to suggest that this is an absolute statement. It's a kind of a most of the time this is a true statement. Agile tends to be focused on smaller systems. And Agile has integrated teams that span the life cycle of a product. Now, let me talk about this notion of being focused on smaller systems for just a moment, because that could be something that could kind of take us off track if you take that too literally. I don't mean to suggest that Agile, either historically or now, is really only used for smaller systems. But if you look at Agile practices, kind of the core of Agile practices, they really emphasize small teams, relatively manageable scope. And in fact, if you're looking at how to build complex systems in Agile, well, we actually have a different set of methods that kind of get layered on to what I'd call kind of core Agile development practices. Things like SAFE, mechanism for coordinating activities across multiple Agile projects. I want to be clear that when I'm talking about Agile here, I'm talking about at the individual project. I'm not trying to address the whole issue of kind of big enterprise Agile coordination between teams that practices like SAFE deal with. This notion of integrated teams that span the life cycle of a product is, in classic Agile, we have the team that's really responsible for the product from end to end. And I pulled that point out specifically because that's quite different than our traditional practice of architecture, where architects are really specialists who are isolated from the rest of development somewhat. So in summary, you can see that historically, the way that these practices evolved, again, particularly in larger organizations, really has followed a different path with a different set of needs and emphasis. And because of that, it's not surprising that there's a little bit of potential for conflict between them. But some of this conflict also comes from myths. There's a myth that architecture should be finalized before design or development starts. That myth, I call it a myth, and I'm not sure that's actually quite fair, because sometimes that's actually embedded into practices in organizations, where there will be an architectural phase where we specify how the system should be built, and then we go through governance and kind of get it approved, and then we make design follow that. And what that means is that the agility, if we do that, if we finalize architecture before design or development starts, we compromise our ability to be agile later. In other words, if I take an architecture that's well developed, it's detailed, and it's kind of decided, okay, now we're done, it's fixed. design and development has to stay within those constraints. And if it turns out that that architecture was exactly what we need, great. But if it turns out that as we're working, we discover that something's not quite the way it should be, we've got a bit of a problem. So we can actually compromise agility if we're bound to this myth that architecture should be finalized before design or development is built. Well, that's actually a nice jumping off point for starting to argue that architecture, agile architecture, is actually greater than agile and architecture separately. Agile and architecture are both very useful practices. They both have delivered considerable value to organizations. But agile architecture is more than just the sum of what we get from agile and what we get from architecture. In other words, having the two of them together actually enhances, enhances our abilities as an organization as a whole. And we can think about where that comes from considering the mindset of what we want to achieve from agile architecture. The agile architecture mindset recognizes that the bigger the system, the longer the runway that needs to be able to have enough space, if you think of it, to be able to be built and take off effectively. Larger systems require more thought up front. They require more kind of framework to be able to be effectively built. They benefit more from having a blueprint to guide development, even if that development is done using agile practices. What agile architecture allows us to do is be better at delivering value incrementally, to be better at being able to have this idea of what the overall solution should be like. And it may be a bit of a sketchy, outliney form, but to know what the shape and structure of that solution will be, so that we can better plan how to think about delivering value incrementally. What parts need to be in place and what time to be able to deliver real business value? What things I need to be able to do to avoid doing rework later? A lot of the agile architecture mindset and the value of agile architecture comes from being able to balance what we call emergent design and intentional architecture. Well, what do we mean by those things? Well, an emergent design is that design that just results from developing, particularly an iterative development process. So if you think about, let's say that we had an agile team and we're just starting to work on developing some application. We don't give any real thought to what its structured organization should be. We just take our backlog and we kind of do some sprint planning and dive in. Well, the resulting system will actually have an architecture in the sense that whatever comes out at the end of the process, it will have a structure and organization. And that architecture is what we call the emergent design. It's what we end up with when we're done. It's the design that emerged from the process. Now, I don't mean to imply that that's necessarily a bad thing. And the design that emerges from a process might be a really good one, but maybe not so much. Maybe it's not ideal. And again, the larger the solution, the more chance that an emergent design is going to end up with some properties that we don't necessarily really want. The other term here was intentional architecture. And that's the architecture that we intend to have before we starting development. It's that architecture we say, I intend the architecture of the final solution to be like this. It's what we plan to have. And I'm going to argue that what we want to have in agile architecture, that part of the agile architecture mindset, is to balance that intentional architecture and emergent architecture. That what we want to have is the right amount of intentional architecture to provide a guide to development. This is part of the essence of being an architect in an agile architecture environment. Can we provide a sketch of that intentional architecture that will guide development without necessarily being too much? Come back to that idea shortly. The purpose of that intentional architecture, that architecture that we develop to guide design, is that we help put some framework, some guidance, some guardrails, if you will, in place So that the emergent design, it emerges, it evolves in the context of that intentional architecture, that overall plan. Now, why would we want to do that? What's the real purpose of that? Well, what we want to have is just enough intentional architecture, enough plan up front, that we give guidance to the team so that as we go forward, as we build the application, instead of essentially designing it in a green field, a kind of blank space, we're designing our solutions as we're going in the context of this framework, this blueprint that describes the rough shape and structure of the overall solution. And the real purpose of that is that we can meet our current and hopefully future needs, and in particular, non-functional needs or quality of service needs. The purpose of that intentional architecture, the purpose of having some architecture thought through and laid out up front, is so that as we're actually working on the development and implementation of our solution, as we're going through our sprints, we're doing it in the context of a thing that's going to have the right organization to have the quality of service attributes that we want. We're going to avoid the possible problem of kind of working on some sprints, developing some software that totally works, but maybe it doesn't have the scalability attributes that we really need because we made some decisions that were kind of locally correct. They were good design decisions at a particular point in time, but they didn't have the overall picture. That's what that intentional architecture is for. That's why there's having some kind of architectural framework to guide development can really help. Now, at the same time, the slide says the right amount of intentional architecture to guide development. Part of the balancing act is making sure that we don't spend so much time up front working on that intentional architecture that we overly constrain development. Remember, we talked about that a little bit earlier. The idea that an architecture that's too detailed, that's got too much worked out ahead of time, will constrain development later. Now, again, if the architecture was right, then that's not a bad thing. But another part of the Agile architecture mindset, we're going to come back to this later, picking up on some ideas about Agile and Lean. Part of the Agile architecture mindset is recognizing that we don't necessarily know everything up front. That just like as we've learned from the success of Agile as a software development practice, that often it's better to kind of do things incrementally. Well, the same thing applies to architecture. That we can develop that architecture incrementally, that emergent architecture. We have that intentional architecture as a framework. And we just try to balance those things. How do we make this actually happen? How do we realize Agile architecture? Well, there's no magic formula for this. There's certainly no magic formula that's going to work for all organizations. But there are a number of guidelines that really that really are general. And one of those is to keep Agile practices that work for you. Now, what I mean by that, I read that now, and that may not be phrased the way I really should have. What I want to say here is that to make Agile architecture real, to realize the promise of Agile architecture, does not mean that we're significantly changing Agile itself. We're not trying to change Agile practices. The Agile practices will generally work. The reason it says keep Agile practices that work for you is because different organizations, different cultures find they need different practices to be effective for them. Well, do the things that work for you. Keep doing things that are Agile. But recognize that there is this balance between having an intentional architecture, thinking about that framework up front, and having that design be able to emerge. And part of the trick here in realizing Agile architecture, realizing the promise of Agile architecture, is recognizing that there is actually a balance between those two things. Intentional architecture is good. Too much intentional architecture is stifling. Emergent design, that design that just emerges organically through the process, is also good, but relying on it too much can lead you into a situation where that emergent design may be a product of kind of the particular path you took to get somewhere and may not actually reflect your long-term needs particularly well. And therefore, to realize the promise of agile architecture, it is necessary to invest somewhat in some architecture initially, really before significant development starts. That intentional architecture is then developed to guide the agile development practice. Now, if that sounds like an argument to just do a bit of architecture up front and hand it off to development, that's not really what I'm trying to say. We want to do a little bit of that initial architecture work up front, but the architects, the agile architects, are first-class participants in the agile team. Now, here's a kind of big change from kind of traditionally how we do agile and how we do architecture, particularly in big organizations. Agile architecture positions architects as part of the team. They're not kind of part of a separate group anymore. They're kind of part of a development team. They're working in sprints. They're right in the process from end to end. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to be full-time for a project. They may not be dedicated 100% to a particular project. But they're not in roles where they're kind of doing a phase and then going away. They're really a resource that's participating fully in the agile development process. And that positioning architects as first-class participants in the team is essential to be able to balance that intentional architecture and emergent design and provide that guidance to the team. But it's a two-way street as well. I don't want to suggest that architects, agile architects, are somehow kind of directing and telling the team what to do. In fact, they're learning from the team as well, because what are they doing? They're learning about the nature of the problem as the team does. So agile architecture is architecture which is agile in the kind of classic sense of the word. The architect is discovering things as they go, as we learn about the product we're developing, and responding to it. Modifying the architecture as necessary, filling in the details, adding to it, and providing their architectural perspective to guide that emergent design. And the last point is refined architecture to support agile development. And what I mean by that is that realizing the value of agile architecture is not just something that we put in a process and we say here are the roles and responsibilities of the agile architect and we're done. We're going to refine the architecture process itself. We're going to refine the architecture that we create. We're going to refine some of the architectural work products that as an organization we typically deal with. So we haven't mentioned it before, but typically in organizations, architects have got a whole toolbox with a bunch of stuff in it. And some of that stuff are patterns and ways of doing things that work for the organization. There's standards. They're kind of standardized ways of doing of representing things that the organization does. Well, those templates, that toolkit of the architects, it's going to get refined through the process as well, because we're going to learn through the process. We're to learn as we go. So what does it mean then to be an agile architect? Well, we can first start with what an agile architect's role is. Now, this is a particular perspective on what an agile architect's role is. Again, we should be flexible about what this is for particular organizations. And depending on the individuals, the nature of the team, the background and capabilities of individual architects, their roles should be different to adapt to the individuals. Remember that part of the Agile Manifesto, we value individuals rather than it didn't say it, but predefined roles. Well, that's what's happening here. We're going to adjust the role depending on how an individual can contribute best to the overall project. But at least as a kind of baseline, we can say that part of the agile architect's role should be to develop an initial architecture. There's a typo there. It should say develop an initial architecture. It's that initial architecture that's done prior to development, and it's done at a fairly high level. What's that high level mean? Well, it means that initial architecture should be as detailed as it needs to be, but not more. Now, if you think that's kind of wishy-washy and hand-wavy and I'm kind of copping out and giving an answer, it's because I totally am. The level of detail that's appropriate for an initial architecture is going to depend on the particular problem at hand. And it should be adapted based on what the nature of the problem is. So things that are relatively routine, that we know how to do something, we've done it a bunch of times before. Well, in some organizations, what that means is we have a much higher level initial architecture because we don't have to really guide people that much. They've done it 12 times before. So, we can just lay out the really big picture, let the team go to it. In some organizations, a really routine problem is actually the exact opposite. We have an initial architecture that's extremely detailed. Why? Well, because we've done it before. So we already have the architecture. So why not just stamp out a new copy of it? On the other hand, a problem that's really innovative, something we've never really done before, what should that initial architecture look like? Well, in most cases, what we're going to want is an initial architecture that's probably a little bit more high level, leaves more to be filled in as we go. Because if the problem is really innovative, we don't know what all the solutions are. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be just a really rough sketch. What we're probably going to do, or at least what I would do, is I would think about, well, if this thing is particularly innovative that we're doing, what are our sources of risk? Where are the things that we really don't know? And are there things that we could lay out and kind of sketch out as maybe have a little bit more detail? Maybe have a number of alternatives. We may do something this way or that other way. We'll see what happens. But to look at what's innovative about the particular thing that we're pursuing and adapt that initial architecture so that we can kind of respond to what we know and what we don't know. Similarly, the level of detail in initial architecture is going to depend on, is going to be influenced by the level of risk. That's both business risk. We don't know whether this is going to succeed in the marketplace, or we don't know whether we've got kind of the right set of business functionality, but also technical risk. Am I trying something that is potentially stretching the limits of some particular technology? And again, we should be looking at that initial architecture and the level of risk and either filling in additional detail or providing a number of alternatives in the architecture to address particular sources of risk. For example, here's a kind of concrete example. If we're addressing a particular business problem, I'm working on a thing now where we're kind of managing a pool of applicants for evaluating essentially competitions. And there are things that we know about that problem and things that we don't know about that problem. One of the things that we don't know about that problem very much is we don't know that much about the nature of kind of the kind of things that people are going to be asked to judge. And so that initial architecture that we're building identifies a particular set of things as requiring very generic solutions that can be configured by business so that business can adapt to the things that they know as they learn them, which we wouldn't necessarily need if we had a set of firm business requirements so everything was really deeply understood. And that's a simple example of adjusting that initial architecture to particular circumstances. The last point on what's the level of detail that is appropriate is going to depend on the experience of the team. And I mean the experience very broadly. It's not just is the team junior or senior. It's what do they know about the particular kinds of problems at hand? Do they have they used a particular technology or a particular technique before? Where we have a situation where I've worked on projects where I have a team who has some really good design and software engineering expertise. That initial architecture can be really high level because we can be sure, we can be confident that the people that there are people on the team who's going to take that and turn that into a well-engineered solution. I've worked with teams where We don't have that. We have people who are really good developers, coders, but they don't have design expertise. That initial architecture has to be more detailed. So we adjust the level of detail to what the experience of the team is. I spent a lot of time on this because I want to really emphasize the idea that what we're trying to produce as an initial architecture, that set of things that we use to kick off the process and guide the team, is not a kind of strictly well-defined thing. Part of the essence of doing this well, and what adds to the agile part of architecture, is that we're really adapting to circumstances, and we should be comfortable with that. In fact, this is such an important point that I think we should be cautious of having templates and standard deliverables. Now, this is something that in a lot of large organizations in particular, we kind of expect to have. You know, thou shalt produce the solution architecture document and it'll have 12 sections and these are the contents. Well, that having standard templates and deliverables is kind of can get in the way of being adaptable to what the particular circumstance is. I've seen an organization who has a standard deliverable, the solution architecture document, that's so detailed that it's got a lot of content that really isn't particularly relevant. And in fact, there's a lot of content that goes way beyond what they really need for an initial architecture, and it ends up sometimes just being discarded by development, or it ends up overly constraining. I don't want to suggest that templates and standard deliverables should be avoided at all costs, but just be cautious and think about the agile part of agile architecture and do the things that are right. Okay, so this has been about creating that initial architecture. Creating that initial architecture, that intentional architecture, is only really the first step in what we do in agile architecture, because we want to involve the whole agile team. Well, okay, it's not just involving the agile team, we're part of that team. But part of what we do as a first-class member of that team is we're going to socialize that initial or intentional architecture with the team. So often what happens is an architect will work either alone or with a small number of people to develop that initial architecture. And then we're going to take it and we're going to socialize it to the team as a whole so that we all understand the whole starting point. And there's actually, in many agile practices, there's a logical place to do this. It's built into the process already. A lot of people follow this agile practice of having a so-called sprint zero. Sprint zero is usually, it's a sprint that's it's the first sprint, counting from zero, so zero-based counting here. But in sprint zero, this is where we're thinking about what's the product, kind of how are we going to approach this, what does it look like, and it's exactly those same set of concerns that concerns architects. What's the structure and organization of the overall solution? So we have, in a lot of agile practices, a kind of logical place to connect the our efforts in creating an initial architecture and starting to work with the team to socialize it. But in the spirit of being agile, the architect should be thinking of this not as an opportunity to say, here team, here's the architecture, I'm going to walk you through it, explain it, and you should all just absorb it. It's actually a discussion, a collaboration. Because what you will inevitably find is the architect, whether they worked alone or with a few people, when they start to talk to people, you're going to start to hear some things. You're going to start to learn some new things. You're going to find some things to think about, and maybe even modify that initial architecture. So in the spirit of agile and having a full cross-functional team, listen and collaborate. It is a discussion. After we've socialized that initial architecture, well, now the agile architect is really, they're a full part of the agile team. The architect, when I say they're first-class member, well, so is everybody else. They're not in a particular silo or an ivory tower. They don't have kind of magic knowledge that other people don't. You certainly don't want people kind of treating the architect in a position of reverence. Everybody on an agile team has special skills and special abilities. That's what they bring to the table. And the architecture is just one of them. As a member of that Agile team, a lot of the role of the Agile architect is to facilitate the discovery of the emergent architecture. Now, there are a number of ways this could be worded. But when I say facilitate the discovery of the emergent architecture, maybe discovery is not quite the right word, but I want to be really clear that part of the role of the Agile architect is this, it's the notion that they're facilitating the, well, emergence, if you will, of the emergent architecture. They're not responsible for it. The whole team as a whole is. So what the Agile architect is doing is they're facilitating the development of that emergent architecture as the project progresses. They're collaborating actively with the entire team. They're taking that initial architecture and kind of building on that framework and modifying it where it needs to. But they're also contributing the perspective that architects have that typically people in development roles have less of an opportunity to have just because of what happens in organizations. Architects typically have a big picture. And that big picture can come from solution architecture, enterprise architecture, segment architecture, depending on what the organization has. And they can use that larger perspective to provide guidance to the team, to help them make decisions that take into account larger enterprise concerns. We can also use it to help manage scope, to have an understanding of what things might be done that are relevant to a solution in other parts of the organization, or maybe push back on scope because it's not really appropriate for it to be done here. In other words, to have the point of view of what the larger enterprise architecture is, the architecture in the larger organization. And the last point I want to make here is it's another important one, but it's another place where we really get more than the value that's more than the sum of the parts by having Agile architecture. Architects are often good at thinking through issues around things like what should be standardized, what standards should be adopted from the outside world, what makes appropriate APIs, or what patterns there are for using APIs consistently across an organization. And so when we think about a particular development effort for a particular project, being able to think about what that might mean in terms of how it connects with other things, how it connects with other systems, what APIs it's exposing and how they work. Architects are in a good position to be able to provide a larger perspective on that than an individual team. It's not a special perspective, it's just they have a different perspective. And they can facilitate the evolution of that emergent architecture around standards and patterns and methods using APIs that are consistent with the rest of the organization. All of the things that we do here, all of these practices, are the context of being lean. And so as we're thinking about what Agile architecture is and how to apply it inside a particular development effort, we want to follow lean principles. We want to build out our practices over time as we develop what works and what doesn't. We want to be continually evaluating and refining what we do and how we think about things and what we deliver. We're looking for continuous improvement. We're never thinking that, okay, now we're done in our practices. And this is true not only of the deliverables that we're producing, the projects that we're actually delivering, but the actual Agile architecture practice and processes itself. So I'm going to close this with a little bit of a look at the Agile architecture process. And it's useful to compare this with kind of the classic architecture process. In classic architecture, what we typically do is architects would develop an architecture which was often pretty detailed. That detailed architecture would go through some governance process, which is often a big onerous process on its own. And then it's handed off to design and development. And then architects move on to the next project. But there are a bunch of things about this that are really anti-agile. One of them is the notion that we have to develop this fairly detailed architecture that often has to meet a certain set of relatively arbitrary requirements to get through a governance gate. Another anti-agile practice here is this, the whole notion of governance as kind of something that's uh, reviewing and approving an architecture is almost kind of a one-time thing, is really kind of anti-agile, because once it's approved, you generally have to stick to it. Well, that constrains your development. And then the notion that architects are just move on to the next project, what that means is those architectural skills, the architectural mindset, is something that isn't taken advantage of in the rest of the development process. Well, things should be rather different in agile architecture. The architect, hopefully in collaboration with some key people from the team, is going to develop an initial architecture, that intentional architecture, but it's pretty minimal. It's lean. It's specifying only the things that are really necessary to help guide development. We socialize with that with the team, kind of make that part of the kind of culture of the team. Get them going in the right direction. But then, and here's a kind of key difference. I know I'm repeating a little bit from the last section. The Agile architect is participating in a first-class member of the team. Maybe another way of saying this would be, now the team is proceeding with an architect as part of the skill set. Contrast that to what we just talked about, the classic architecture process, where architectural thinking is something that happens before and not during development because, well, we sent off the architect to do something else. Now we have those architectural mindset and capabilities that we can draw on as part of the team so that we can continually refine the architecture. This sounds like a bit of a hand-wavy description of a process. It is, because people are going to incorporate this into their organizations in different ways. And part of the challenge that we'll have is a number of challenges in making this actually happen. Some of the organizational challenges that we face, and these are things that the bigger the organization, typically the harder these challenges are. What does architecture governance mean in an agile architecture world? What does governance in general mean in agile? I mean, I'm sure this is something that those of you who've gone through agile in large organizations have struggled with already. If you have strong governance culture, it can be a challenge to make that work with agile. Well, same thing with architectural governance. Can we figure out how to have some governance that actually adds value without being arbitrary? Well, yeah, you can. Just have to kind of think those things through. How do we assign architects to teams? This can be a challenge. If we have architecture as a separate department, and we think about architecture in a project way, where we say, okay, I'm going to assign Alice and Bob as architects to the widget project, and I expect them back in 3 months when they finished, because I'm going to assign them to the Doodad project. Well, now what I want to be able to do is say I've got Alice and Bob and Kathy and Dave and all the other architects. How do we allocate them to teams so they can actually be part of the team, and yet be often architects are part of a kind of resource pool that's runs across multiple projects. That's a potential challenge to organizations. What are actual architectural deliverables? What do we expect architects to actually do? A lot of traditional architecture can be focused around specific deliverables, and we can measure progress by looking at, did Alice complete the such and such deliverable for the widget project? Okay. Well, that may change a little bit when we're in a more agile environment. And what goes in the architectural repository? Now, this particular issue doesn't necessarily apply to all organizations, but in a lot of organizations where we have an established architecture practice, we have a repository of architectural knowledge, architectural documents. And what happens to that? How do we kind of make use of that, leverage that in an agile architecture context? Because that repository is really, really valuable. Well, I'm not going to try and suggest that I have all the answers. They are going to vary by organization, but these are some of the challenges that organizations will deal with. The challenges that individual architects are going to have to deal with as they're becoming more practicing agile architecture. And one of those challenges, and I find this architects sometimes have a bit of a struggle with this, is the lean mindset, adapting lean practices. The idea that we do things that are required when they're required. We think about the process and what needs to be done rather than kind of having similar solutions for everything. Another challenge is being comfortable with deferring detail. What I mean by that is being okay with the idea that we start with an initial architecture that sketches out at a certain level of detail what the overall structure and organization of a solution will be, but doesn't go into too much. We're used to providing more and more detail. And the idea that we can say, I'm going to provide a rough sketch and kind of not need to fill in the blanks more can be very uncomfortable for people who are used to working in a classic architecture world. And another part of this is I call it deeper technical depth, because I don't really know how to say it. But when an architect steps into an agile development team, they become part of that development team. Typically what happens is they are exposed to a whole bunch of levels of detail, particularly around technology, that wasn't really part of their consideration before. And I'm not suggesting that an architect all of a sudden necessarily has to know how to code, know the intricacies of data representation in JavaScript or whatever it happens to be. But they're going to be exposed to more of the full stack of development practices. And again, that can be challenging for people who kind of are uncomfortable with not knowing everything. These challenges are not insignificant, but there's some real payoff. So here's the bottom line for what you can get as an organization. One of the things that you should be able to achieve with agile architecture is more predictable delivery. In other words, we should be able to have more consistent delivery that's more predictable in terms of what we're going to get, what its nature is, how it's going to work, what are its quality or service attributes. We'll typically get greater attention to non-functional concerns, things like availability and scalability. Now, sometimes organizations are really set up to focus on those things going in. But a lot of times in agile development, we don't necessarily have enough of a focus on that initially. And we end up in situations where we've kind of backed ourselves into a bit of a corner. Well, agile architecture will help with that. It can help greatly with alignment across projects. Where we have multiple projects going on, the architectural perspective on things like interoperability, connection, API standards can really help across projects. Ultimately, what we're looking for is better long-term products. Better is hard to define, but better in the sense of the long-term value that they deliver to the organization, not just in the set of functions that they provide, but in their maintainability, their extensibility, what we can do with them, how adaptable we are to different business challenges. And a big part of this payoff comes from reduced barriers between architecture and development. Really, the bottom line is we can really help align development to the overall business vision. The payoffs are for the individual as well. And this is, at least personally, this is where I find a lot of what's exciting about this agile architecture movement. As an individual, it allows us to, well, essentially be part of a bigger stage. It's a deeper challenge. There's kind of more technical things to be concerned with, a broader set of opportunities, more interesting things to follow. And if you're the kind of person who's kind of interested in everything, which I find a lot of architects are, the agile architecture role really gives us a lot of opportunity to be exposed to things that really we were watching from the sidelines before. But another big part of this is I've talked to a lot of people in architecture who have a frustration with, they do their work and then they move on to something else. they never really get to see the product that they're architecting actually move into production, at least not firsthand. And part of the individual payoff for Agile architects is that's exactly what we get. We're part of the process of actually delivering that thing. And that could be personally very satisfying. The key message, the kind of bottom line here, is that Agile architecture really joins architecture and Agile practices, architecture and traditional Agile development together. The architects become first-class participants in the overall process. That can be a significant change for the organization and for individuals, but brace yourself and enjoy the ride. Now, thank you for listening to this. We're getting close to time, but I am going to stay on for questions. If anybody wants to ask anything, questions and chat is open. I do want to point out a few classes that are coming up, and I'll just leave the screen on here for a moment. I'll move to contact in just a moment. But we have a range of architectural courses that are coming up. These are all guaranteed to run, and if there's anything that's of interest to you, I would really encourage you to look into these. Go to webagesolutions.com or contact your representative. There's your contact information. I'm going to thank everybody again for the time that you spent today. I really appreciate it. Questions? Thank you. So I have a question. Kevin, thank you. Do we put less value in roadmaps when adapting Agile architecture practices? Kevin, it depends very much on what your organization means by a roadmap, because different people mean different things by that. When I say roadmap, what I usually mean is, the way I use the term at least, the roadmap is a set of initiatives that are taking the organization to some new state. Oh, I see, you clarified. You're dealing with a lot of portfolio roadmaps. Okay, you and I use roadmaps in the same way. So to me, roadmap, and I think this is what you mean by roadmap as well. A roadmap is a set of activities that the organization will go through to achieve some future state. So it might be, well, we're going to do this with a widget project, and then this with the doodad project, and we're going to integrate doodads and widgets over here with some marketing thing. Do we do less of that in Agile architecture? No, I don't think so. In my opinion, Agile architecture practices, at least the way I've described them here, are about how we apply architecture in an Agile way to develop a particular solution. A roadmap, at least in the way that I use the term, gives us a roadmap for how we compose a bunch of different solutions together to achieve a bigger end. So to me, in an Agile architecture environment, the roadmap has exactly the same value as it always did. It's guiding the whole organization. It's helping us plan what initiatives have to happen. How we actually do a particular initiative, in other words, how we perform one of the roadmap activities, well, to me, that's a solution, and that's what we would apply Agile architecture to. And I guess as I'm saying this, it's implicit that I think Agile architecture is something that is typically done for solutions. When you think about enterprise architecture and kind of road mapping for an entire enterprise, personally, I don't see that changing. I don't see there being some radically different way of doing it just because we slapped an Agile label on it. That bigger picture enterprise architecture activities, I think those are still completely valid. So thank you. Excellent and interesting question.